5 years, Peter Sutcliffe terrorized the UK, leaving women across the country afraid to step outside after dark. He claimed he was cleaning up the streets, but his brutal murders told a different story. Police interviewed him 9 times and still missed their man, thanks to outdated methods and one truly bizarre hoax. This is the story of how the Yorkshire Ripper evaded capture, the failures that kept him killing, and the shocking way he was finally caught. But before we get into that story, if you like your true crime brief and bingeable, you've found the right podcast. Tap the follow button now for access to at least 2 episodes per week. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder. Let's get into it. Bastard prostitutes who were littering the streets. I was just cleaning up the place a bit. Those were the words of a man whose reign of terror gripped the UK for 5 years, the Yorkshire Ripper. At his peak, his crimes left the police urging women of all ages to stay locked indoors, warning that as long as he was on the loose, no one was safe. Before Peter Sutcliffe became one of Britain's most infamous serial killers, he was a child exposed to violence that would shape his life in unimaginable ways. Born prematurely in 1946, Peter's arrival into the world was already marked by trauma. His mother, Kathleen, had endured a violent beating from his father, John, while heavily pregnant, sending her into early labor. After 2 weeks in the hospital, mother and child returned to a home where fear was constant. With more children came more visits for John's cruelty, and Peter didn't escape his father's wrath. One Christmas, John smashed a beer glass over Peter's head simply because the boy had dared to sit in his chair at the dinner table. For John, his abuse had a twisted justification. He believed Peter was weak, a slim, timid boy who lacked the toughness John thought a son should have. Worse still, Peter's habit of seeking comfort from his mother after beatings only made him more of a target in John's eyes. The atmosphere in our house would change as soon as John walked in. One of Peter's siblings later recounted, his life revolved around playing football, cricket, singing in choir, and womanizing. This was the environment that shaped Peter Sutcliffe, a home where violence wasn't just a possibility, it was the norm. It's impossible to ignore how these early years set the stage for what was to come. John Sutcliffe lived his life by a double standard. While he enjoyed the freedom of womanizing, he demanded loyalty from Kathleen, his wife. When she strayed, John responded with cruelty designed to humiliate her and leave a lasting mark on their children. Peter recalled one particularly scarring moment when John took him and his younger siblings to a hotel, ostensibly to catch Kathleen meeting her lover. What Kathleen found instead was her furious husband and her horrified children. The public shaming that followed was seared into the family's memory and left deep emotional scars, particularly on Peter. As Peter entered his teenage years, he developed an unsettling habit, spying on sex workers while they were with clients. What began as voyeurism laid the groundwork for a disturbing obsession that would later define his crimes. Meanwhile, Peter found another fixation in his brief stint at a local cemetery. Initially hired to dig graves, he became fascinated with preparing bodies for burial. Washing and handling corpses became a task he was disturbingly drawn to, often staying late to immerse himself in the process. After leaving school at 15, Peter moved between jobs until he settled into work as a truck driver. This gave him an intimate understanding of Britain's streets, neighborhoods, and isolated areas, knowledge that would later aid him in evading capture. Violence, humiliation, voyeurism, and an obsession with death. Peter Sutcliffe's formative years were a perfect storm of influence that shaped him into one of Britain's most notorious killers. But before he became the Yorkshire Ripper, one more key element would push him over the edge. In the spring of 1967, Peter Sutcliffe met 16-year-old Sonia, with a last name I'm not going to attempt, and the two quickly fell in love. It would take 7 years for them to marry, but Peter seemed to find in Sonia the kind of chaotic comfort that echoed his childhood. Sonia, diagnosed with schizophrenia, often directed emotional and physical outbursts at her husband. Remarkably, Peter rarely retaliated. At most, he would pin her arms to stop her from hitting him further. The relationship was turbulent, but it was one Peter accepted, maybe because he was used to the dysfunction. The couple's shared heartbreak came in the form of repeated miscarriages. Every time Sonia became pregnant, the pregnancy would end in loss. After this devastating cycle repeated itself, doctors finally uncovered the truth. Sonia was unable to have children. Sonia turned to an affair with a local ice cream van driver, maybe as a way to cope. Peter surprisingly forgave her infidelity, but by then he had already found his way to release his frustrations, and it was far more sinister. Peter's outlet for his growing rage revealed itself in 1975. He was already known to have attacked a prostitute, striking her on the head with a sock filled with stones. She survived, but Peter wasn't deterred. That summer, he escalated. 36-year-old Anna Rogalski became his next target. Peter struck her on the back of the head with a hammer and slashed her stomach open with a knife. Her life was saved only because a neighbor heard the commotion and interrupted the attack. Just a month later, Peter struck again. This time, the victim was 46-year-old Olive Smelt, whom he attacked in a nearly identical manner. Once again, the attack was interrupted, sparing Olive's life. She told the police her assailant had spoken with a distinct Yorkshire accent. Her testimony, however, was largely dismissed because of her profession. Peter's escalating violence and the alarming similarities in his attacks came to form a pattern, one that wouldn't be fully recognized until it was too late. Each attack brought him closer to his eventual transformation into the Yorkshire Ripper. It was the autumn of 1975 when Peter took his first life. 28-year-old Wilma Mary McCann left her house one evening and was brutally attacked, struck on the back of the head, and killed. The investigation into her murder was enormous, involving over 150 police officers, yet none managed to connect Peter to the crime. Peter didn't stop there. He struck again and again, targeting sex workers in particular, and almost always ending their lives. For a time, the general public clung to a false sense of security, believing that the killer, dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper at this time, was only targeting a specific group of women. But that illusion shattered when Peter widened his focus. Peter's victims began to include women from all walks of life: teenagers, mothers, and women with, air quotes, respectable jobs. Some were simply making their way home when they crossed paths with him. The violence was no longer contained to a single group, and the public's fear spread like wildfire. Mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters suddenly felt like they could be next. Despite the escalating body count, there was hope, or so it seemed. During the course of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, Peter was interviewed by police a staggering 9 times. Surely, with that level of scrutiny, the killer's reign of terror was on borrowed time. Yet, every single time Peter was brought in, he was released. The reasons for this were maddening. The police were operating with what we'd now consider antiquated systems. There were no computers or searchable databases. Every lead, every clue, every shred of evidence was written down on index cards and filed away. By the end of the investigation, there were so many cabinets filled with these cards that the floors of the storage room had to be reinforced. What could have been an opportunity to connect the dots became an overwhelming mess of information, allowing Peter Sutcliffe to evade capture again and again. The public's hope dimmed, and the fear of the Yorkshire Ripper grew stronger with every passing day. One of the most frustrating missteps in the investigation came from a hoax that diverted precious resources. A man sent in a tape claiming to be the Ripper himself. On the recording, his voice lacked the distinctive Yorkshire accent, but investigators believed it was legitimate. This red herring led them to chase leads far from Yorkshire, pulling their focus away from the actual killer. By the winter of 1981, luck, or persistence, finally turned in the police's favor. An officer noticed a man sitting in a car with false license plates. The man was arrested and brought in for questioning. His appearance matched descriptions provided by surviving victims of the Ripper. Even more telling, at the time of his arrest, he'd been sitting beside one of the Ripper's usual targets, a sex worker. This man was Peter Sutcliffe. Naturally, he denied everything. The following day, investigators revisited the spot where Peter had been arrested. There, behind an oil storage tank, they found a knife, a hammer, and a piece of rope. tools Sutcliffe had attempted to discard under the guise of relieving himself during his arrest. At the police station, another knife was recovered from a restroom he'd used. After 2 days of interrogation, Peter Sutcliffe made a shocking pivot. He confessed. He admitted to not only the murders and attacks the police had connected him to, but also others they hadn't yet uncovered. Peter Sutcliffe's confirmed victim count stood at 13 murders and at least 7 attempted murders during his years of terror. Later, he'd admitted at least 2 more killings, though these remain unconfirmed. At trial, Sutcliffe attempted to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that he'd been commanded to kill by divine voices. The courts, however, rejected this plea and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Peter Sutcliffe remained behind bars until his death at the age of 74 in 2020. He'd contracted COVID-19 and refused treatment, marking a quiet end to the life of one of Britain's most notorious killers. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If this is your first time listening, I'm stoked that you're here. And also, I don't know why I used the word stoked. I don't think I've ever used it in my life, but it's a first for all of us today. Anyway, I'm glad that you're here. Make sure you hit subscribe wherever you are listening to this podcast right now, and follow on social media. If you're an OG listener, you've been on these streets for a while, I really appreciate you. And please continue to share this podcast with your friends, family, neighbor, veterinarian, post office worker, anyone that you think could be into brief true crime stories. And if you think, well, maybe they're not necessarily into murders, Joe, let's back up on that one. Good news, I also do the podcast 10-Minute Mystery, which isn't necessarily about murders. It could be, but it's mostly not. 10-Minute Mystery, wherever you like listening to podcasts, you can search it up and you can find it there. And some of you have reached out over the years of me doing this podcast and asked, how can you help? Some of you have offered to research cases for me, to directly pay me for some reason. And I always turn that down. But here is how you can actually, 2 ways actually, how you could help this podcast if you want to. First of all, you could buy something in the merch shop. I get a little bit of money from that, which I put back into the podcast to make the episodes better, do more research, blah, 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 blah. You can buy something in the merch shop. Or you could simply, what I've already mentioned, tell your friends and family about this podcast. That's it. It seems like a small thing, but most of you that hear me and think, yeah, I'll do that, you don't. Some of you do, and I really, really do appreciate that. I know that you do because the podcast numbers always grow, so some of you are doing it. And it's not a necessity. You could tell not another living soul about this podcast, and I still love you for listening to it. But if you want to help, that's a good way to do it. Anyway, I'm rambling now, so I will end it with this. Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Murder.